introduce it. So before we go any further, I'd like to spend a couple minutes to get to know our panelists, both Jess and Leisa. So Jess, if you want to introduce yourself and tell us about you and the ways you're involved in ministry and anything else you think might be useful for us to know.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Garceau. Matt and I know each other quite well because along with our colleague, Zach Stahowski, we run the One Call Institute. If you haven't heard of us, look us up on social media or on our website. But I have been working for the past, I would say about 13 years, developing young liturgical musicians and their mentors. It's definitely a passion of mine on the church end of things. And then, as you may have guessed from the title of this particular presentation, I do work for Target Corporation. I've worked there for about the last 10 years. Today, I'm speaking as my experience as an employee, not on behalf of Target. But my experience and knowledge of change management also comes from my master's in organizational leadership that I earned from St. Mary's University here in Minnesota.
And I was told that there would be a Target discount code that we would be getting.
Yes, it's called Target Circle. Look it up on the Target.
Thanks, Jess. And Leisa.
My name is Leisa Anslinger. I come from Loveland, Ohio, which is within the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. Have experience in parish ministry. Have been on the team of One Call, a long time member of National Association of Pastoral Musicians. And my current role is as the director for the Center for Pastoral Vitality for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, which includes things like the Office of Worship and the Office of Pastoral Planning, which of course gets into our topic today in change leadership.
Great, wonderful. And again, thank you both for being here. And for all of you who are attending this session live, again, in the Q&A at the bottom, you can begin to add in all kinds of questions or things that you want to make sure we talk about. So we're talking about change management, and like any good conversation, if we start at the beginning by defining and exploring our terms, I think that would be helpful. So oftentimes, both of those words, change and management, can inflict fear and trepidation, right? And all kinds of emotions. So maybe if we talk about this concept of change, let's just get to the real human element. Like we as humans don't like change, or statistically, most people in organizations don't like change. Why is that? Why do people tend to be change averse or change resistant?
Yeah, as Leisa and I had some of these conversations heading into today. One of the articles Matt will share around the theories of change quote that like more than 60% of employees generally have like a pretty firm fear of change. Change is hard, it's overwhelming, and often, especially in the church as ministers, we don't necessarily have structure or a process to help guide us through that change. Which is why we're going to kind of tie together like what we know about best practices from the business world into how we apply that to our church. I think there's definitely a feeling of having to go through change on your own, especially if you're the leader of change. It can be very isolating. And then if your organization is struggling, if your church and community is struggling with your mission or your vision, it can be more challenging to face change because you don't have that guidepost to keep bouncing things back to ensure that your change is moving you forward in support of that mission and vision.
And I'd add to that, I think one of the things that we're going to be doing today is sort of going back and forth with some of the theoretical foundational things about change and then applying that to our pastoral situations. And as I've talked with parish leaders, a lot of what I hear is, we go through a planning process of some sort, whether it's in a pastoral council or it's in the worship commission or whatever the group might be. We talk a lot about what needs to change, and then nothing ever happens. And I think part of that is we don't always follow through. We may say this is where we're heading, but we don't identify the structure that will help us to enact the change that we know we're called to make. And because of that, it feels like we just keep spinning our wheels. We don't have really positive experiences with change all the time in our pastoral life.
Yeah, I as a recovering administrator in a school setting, I there was the part of me, the sort of on an academic or philosophical level, I always appreciated at the heart of what we were doing whenever we'd have an accreditation visit or we would revisit our mission or strategic plan. And then, of course, the frustrating part is we have structures in place to develop those statements, but we don't have structures in place to internalize and enact those statements. And so, we write a strategic plan or a statement of vision or mission. I see Bex Gaunt's comment of, with no mission or vision, change is extra tough. And that's right, because oftentimes we all have a mission statement, but we don't know it, or we don't have the structure to use it. So we put it on the shelf and then revisit it and dust it off the next time the committee's coming. And obviously that's not helpful. That we're good at writing reports.
Right. Right.
So I don't think we have to belabor the point that people are afraid of change or sometimes fear change. I think we all have experiences of that personally, or we can run through our mental Rolodexes of all the people who come to mind when we talk about fearing change, especially in a ministerial context. So let's talk about, again, what change is and what it isn't. And then maybe also as an add-on to that, like whose responsibility is change and who helps manage change. But maybe first, if we could start with what we are or are not talking about when we discuss change.
Yeah, so I think we all know what change is, and I think we all know and mostly understand what management is. But change management as a theory is really how we prepare, equip, and support individuals to adopt a change. And typically it has like a mission behind it, right? Like we're trying to adopt the change in order to drive success, in order to achieve a specific outcome. So we're gonna prepare, equip, and support our communities to help achieve a mission or a goal. And that's, in theory, what change management is. In our cases, it's gonna be in our parish, or as an individual, you might be driving change in your family, or we as members of society are driving change in our local governments. So change management isn't just a business structural technique. It's really something that helps us all compartmentalize and use tools and resources that are already out there and exist today, and best practices that exist today to help move things forward. Change from that standpoint then is a very intentional endeavor. It's not a whim. It's not this kind of like thing that happens to us. Change management is an intentional effort to achieve that goal. And anyone can be in charge of that change. It could be because you have an administrative role and your title then says you must lead this change. But any one of us at any point in time in our lives lead change. And the more intentional we are about it, that's what changes it from a reaction into leading and managing the change.
And just in the midst of that, you talked about that, we're aiming for, we have to know what we're aiming for. One of the things that has just really helped me with this is a TED Talk by a man whose name is Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K, where he talks about the importance of knowing why we're doing what we're doing. Now that sounds simple, of course we know why. And yet it's interesting because most of us, we're going to go immediately to the, well, what do we need to do? And so we tend toward that what first, where what Sinek says is our brains are actually wired in such a way that we need to know why we're going to make this change. Easy example of this is, as all of us have lived through this last few months, and we've gone through a suspension of public liturgy, and then through that, all of the various guidelines and what do we do about this and how do we navigate that, and well, what about weddings and what about funerals, and so we had to talk at the diocesan level about our overarching principle with this will be to contribute to the common good and human flourishing. And so there's the why. Why are we making all these adaptations? Because if we don't, then we're not doing what we're called to do as leaders in this moment in time. And that really made a difference, because then every step of the way, when we started talking about, well, does that mean no holy water in the holy water fund? Yes, it probably does. And all of those things, kind of came domino effect from that. But had we not had that first conversation about why, we could have easily gotten caught up in the what, without that foundation that really made a difference.
Yeah, in the no, I think that's a helpful example, and just when you lay out that this sort of 3 part, approach here, the prepare, equip, and support. I think that's a really helpful formula, not only in envisioning how to make change management effective, so it avoids the let's develop a bunch of documents, put them in a binder, put it on the shelf that many of us have experienced. But also it helps understand a little bit of like what's the prior knowledge or pre-work that also needs to be done coming to the table. And Leisa, I know you in particular have done a lot of work with Strengths Finder and things, and that's a whole nother conversation and webinar, right? A whole nother week of stuff. But I wonder, like when we're talking about change management, before we even step up to the plate for change management, what are the foundations that we need to have in terms of our own knowledge or awareness? Because I think, I think of communities that restate a mission statement, or new organizations trying to write a mission statement. There's so much introspection that happens first. Or if I think of as an individual trying to understand my role in change, I have to spend so much time first understanding who I am or who I am not. So I wonder if under that prepare step, what does that look like? What are some of those introspection questions, processes, tools we access either individually or organizationally?
I think a couple of things. I think you're spot on with, we need to understand ourselves, and we really need to claim what is it that we know that we bring. And as a person of my generation, I was taught very clearly, in my mother's words, don't toot your own horn, which is a way of sort of casting out this kind of mindset of what really is a false sense of humility, rather than saying, I know that I have particular gifts and strengths, and I know that there are some things that I don't do well. And specifically related to this, and I may have shared this in another webinar at some other point, I know that I am like the world's worst inviter. I'm the person that's talking you out of it while I'm inviting you to participate. I know you really don't have time, but blah, blah, blah. And so for me, if I'm going to be part of a change initiative, I'm going to have to partner with somebody that has some of that influencing kind of talent, because that's not what I bring. But there are others that don't bring the gifts that I do. And so Jess and I have talked a lot about that need to have a guiding coalition, a group. And not only are we going to be looking at the gifts that each of us has individually, but we're also going to be looking at our circles of influence. Maybe you have someone who's very involved in liturgical ministry, but maybe you need someone who's involved in social ministry or in service and outreach or in catechesis, so that as you begin to plot your course, that you're hearing from as wide a range of experiences within the pastoral situation as you possibly can.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's super helpful. I mean, at least speaking for myself, I think that's super helpful to hear that and understand that. And I think too, and Jess, I don't know if this is something that that you wish to speak to or not. And I mean, and at some point, soon here, what we're going to do, just for everybody listening, so you get a sense of what our roadmap is, we'll move into sort of the theoretical application. Then how do we think about what change management looks like, and what are the theoretical approaches that so we can understand them and then know how to apply them. But before we move away from this understanding of what change management is or isn't, and sort of defining our terms, I mean, I know you have finished a graduate program in organizational management, right? You work in the corporate world and in the ministerial world, and you're just an aware human being who's been paying attention over the last couple of months. How do you look at what's happening? And I don't want to put you on the spot here, but how do you look at everything that's happening in 2020? I mean, we have so many things that are going on. And then if you stop and think about it, not only do we have, Black Lives Matter, and of course, where we are in Minnesota, the murder of George Floyd and all the other conversations that come from it. We have pandemic. We have all kinds of other issues that are happening. Leisa, you're dealing with what so many of us are dealing with, which is pastoral planning and the closures or mergers or twinnings or reorganization of parish structure. How could we forget, in a few months we have a presidential election that's coming up. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's back in the hospital, right? We have all of these things that are happening. So just as you go through this, like how do you from the change management perspective, do you look at this like, is this just a real opportunity? Is this like how do you read 2020 through this organizational change management lens?
Yeah, so when I was in undergrad, we often would quote the change of a culture, like a true culture of a business, a society, et cetera, could take 7 or more years. That wasn't that long ago. I mean, it was maybe a little over a decade, but nonetheless, it wasn't that long ago. And I would argue that even then, that was probably outdated information. And today, I often quote that like, what used to take 7 years now takes 7 minutes, because it can truly, like, we're in a situation in 2020 where one action can truly change everything. It can radically stir up people's emotions. It can point us on a journey that we didn't know we were ready or willing to take. And there's been, I would say 2020 is like a year of a call to action that we never intended to be across, all facets of our lives. Teaching your children at home. Wow, okay, I didn't want to be a teacher, but sounds like a plan. So like there's a lot of unique elements, and I think of it as like, I'm super blessed in that I already have this background in change management. But if you don't, you're not alone, you're not isolated. Like, we have tools that we've never had before. We have networks of people that we've never had before. And we've got great organizations like GIA who are putting out educational content that allow us to process and seek resources to help support us in this change journey across all topics. So the resources are there, and now it's about kind of picking up those different tools and figuring out how can you start really practicing what you preach, and start like learn and absorb as much as you can, and then put it into action, because that's the best way we all learn, is doing it over and over again. And the more you do it personally or with your family or with your church, the more it just becomes second nature, and then you are a change manager whether you want to be or not. It's part of your toolkit.
I think that's great. And I think, even as I think about, again, as just an individual thinking about these days, I'm struck by the amount of personal agency we all have. We're all stuck at home. We all have the ability to communicate with the world, and how do we all feel called, and what do we feel called to do? Especially big, important questions and issues. And I think it's, whether you've given me the language to think about this, those moments of discomfort or struggle, how do I feel, prepared? Do I feel like I have the understanding or not? And I find myself reading everything I can, and trying to find more information. How do I feel equipped, right? And how do I feel supported? I think those are all things that we're starting to feel. So
what
we're
I'll say
going
about change management in general is that you don't have to know what the solution is to work on change management. Like, often the best solutions come from, hey, we or someone identified this problem, and now I feel called that I need to take action. And maybe that's where I'm going to pull together my coalition of friends and people at the parish or in my personal life to say, okay, here's what we need to solve. What are all the ideas we have? How do we get to a solution that then we need to enact and bring through the change management process to successfully integrate into our lives?
Yeah, no, that's great.
I think especially in moments like this, we also have to accept that there is no one answer. And that's hard. It would be really easy if we could all say, okay, in this situation, this is what we do. So that those conversations in that coalition, and beginning to kind of experiment, if we can, if it's a situation where we don't have to do something immediately, we begin to experiment kind of in a safe way with something that we're relatively certain is going to go well. And then we build on that. And we remind ourselves that we all have things that we can build on, that it's not as though we can start over completely and entirely. We don't have a blank slate. And maybe we don't want one, but instead we begin to look at what do we have to build on. I've been talking with a lot of parish people in the last month about, as you begin to reopen, if you're able to reopen, begin to look at what are the things that we really don't want to lose in this moment. It may be different, but we want to continue to sustain those things in some fashion. What is it that maybe we need to just let go of? as a parish leader, we had a very active Stephen ministry. Stephen ministers are trained as sort of quiet companions for people in times of crisis. And for a few years, that Stephen ministry flourished. They were always busy. They always had more people asking for help than they could possibly have. And then little by little, the referrals started to dwindle down. Well, what had happened was there were all sorts of new resources available both at the parish and in our local community. And so we had to look at that really carefully. And the Stephen minister said, all we want to do is help. It doesn't have to be in this way. And so they ended up, deciding to, to point their energy and attention and care in the areas where people still need it. And then things flourished again. But that was a really hard conversation. We had to say, sometimes we have to let things go in order to thrive in a different sort of way for the future.
Yeah. I don't want to make this sound like it's just a matter of semantics, right? But I mean, it also seems like at the heart of what you're both describing, and even the situation that you gave, Leisa, that there's within change management, one of the important sort of philosophical or terminology understandings is that, mission is not the same thing as tactics, right? Or strategies, right? And that ultimately, and again, I'm not trying to gloss over the difficulty of change, but oftentimes when we talk about change, it's the emphasis on changing maybe our tactics, maybe changing a program, maybe changing a strategy, but not ultimately changing the substance at the heart of that mission. And I think a lot of our parish communities and school communities have seen that with the pandemic. We have a question here that I think a couple of versions of this question, which essentially is, could any of you talk about an example that you've seen of change management in action that has made a difference, right? And I think that's a really important example, and we can find all kinds of instances of that through the pandemic. But I'm wondering if you have an example, maybe in addition to what you mentioned, Leisa or Jess, of seeing change management action, just so we understand what it looks like a little more.
Yeah. I do, but I want to know if Jess does.
I do on the corporate end, but do you want to give the parish end? And then,
well, the thing that came to mind for me, and actually, and I'm not pitching a book, but I wrote a book about this because it was such a clear example, was as a parish leader, making the transition from an academic year RCIA to a year-round catechumenate process. And recognizing that there is a role about change. Bottom line in our lives as Christian disciples is about conversion. And there's a personal element to that. Within the RCIA, there was a process element to that. And then there was also implication for the wider parish. And so we actually used one of the theories of change management that Jess will talk about from Dr. John Cotter. And we used his steps to enact that change. And we're very intentional about it. And because of that intentional process that we used, it happened. And it happened actually probably less traumatically as it might have in other situations. But having that framework really made a difference for us.
I love that example. From a corporate lens, having to do with the pandemic, one of the things I'm most proud of the company I work for right now is that we are putting people first. Our employees, as well as our guests in the store. And so as we've had to do a lot of trial and error as one of our many change tactics throughout this time period, because it's moving so fast that you just have to figure out what's going to work today and then what might work tomorrow. And using that feedback loop from our employees and from our customers to say, okay, what's working, what are we hearing, and then continuing to implement or evolve the change. So it's very much this kind of circular movement of learning and applying. And that, I think you'll see as we start to talk about some of the theoretical approaches, is just kind of a natural cycle that you'll get into, whether in a parish or not, to approaching change. Because change isn't stagnant. Even once you've completed the change isn't over.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I think just anecdotally from my position at GIA and involvement with other things like One Call and other organizations, it's been interesting to see the way that communities have been able to navigate, successfully or with moderate success, the pandemic, changing the way they've experienced who they are, but finding ways to still get to the heart of who they are. There's one parish in Chicago I know that has a lot of, social outreach to members and finding ways to say, okay, well, we would do a lot of hospitality when people would gather together, and we can't, because we can't get together for liturgy. And that doesn't change who we are. It changes how we let people know we're there. So they picked a odd time of the morning, like 9:37 or something like that every morning, and rang their bells for 2 minutes, as a way to let everybody in the neighborhood know we're here and we're thinking about you and praying for you. I mean, and I'm not so much talking about that tactic as I'm saying it's a different way for this community to say, this is who we are, and we're going to find what we can do to express that the fact that mission and identity hasn't changed, but perhaps the tactic itself does. And it makes the uncertainty maybe a little less scary, or it makes the loss maybe not easier to bear, but just it's different than when I feel like I could still be myself, our community can be itself, than if we lose our tactics, if we're just about tactics,
Yeah.
But let's transition, if we could, to the theory here. And I know, Leisa, you mentioned Dr. Cotter, and I know that there are several other theories that exist in change management. And what I'll do, those of you watching live, is I will put in the chat box here in a second a link to the article that you're going to talk about, Jess. But let's talk a little bit about theories and approaches.
Yeah, so change management, this is another one of those things that can scare people, is that there are theories out there. And so but again, it's a theory. It's a structure and a guideline and a tool to use. It's not going to give you the answers. It's not going to walk you through it step by step. So I just picked one of the many, many articles that I thought pretty easily explains some of the key theories that I often go back to and use frequently, I would say. The easiest of which that I thought I'd focus on today, and then weave a couple of the others into, is Lewin's change theory. In the article itself, I think it's toward the bottom, but it's a 3-step process, which is why I wanted to focus on it, because it's a little easier to break down. So Lewin specifically, who's kind of thought of as like the first real change management theory, has 3 steps. It's to unfreeze, to change, and to refreeze. Super simple, right? And especially from Minnesota, I think about freezing all the time. Unfreeze, we change, and we refreeze. Another way to think about this is to think about it as we prepare to change, we change, and then we try and get to that new status quo. And so even if we think about what I was speaking of earlier, we prepare, we equip, and we support, right? So this change management theory, I would say all of the other change management theories can really be broken down back into these 3 groups, and you'll see that throughout. So preparing to change is really thinking through, like, what is the change? What's calling us to action? What are our foundational cores that we're not going to change? And then how does the change support who we are and what we're trying to achieve? The change itself is going to be a lot about communication. So people are also afraid to change because change fails a lot. It fails a lot, like, I'll be honest. And part of that's because we don't equip our communities in the right way. And a lot, I would say 40% of it, is because we don't communicate it the right way. And then this refreeze, to me, is all about the feedback loop. So when I talk about those cycles of change that really continue and evolve, is even when you think the change is done, or the change as you've designed it is complete, you need to continue to receive that feedback and understand that, like, if it's something that's changed, it likely will need to continue to be tweaked and evolved, and we'll continue to build on it. And or at some point it's going to become obsolete. What was a great idea a year ago, then a pandemic hits, and now suddenly we're moving on, right? One of the important parts of change that Leisa and I have talked about a lot is this kind of time to grieve. And I think that this is something that really resonates, especially in our parish communities. Kubler-Ross has the 5 steps to grief, and that's considered a change management theory. So that might be one that you've actually heard of or practiced. I know a lot of nursing students know it pretty well. But this time to grieve is really kind of in this pre-unfreeze change and just the beginning of the change theory, where you're really thinking through how do I let go of what was and really come to a place where I'm open to and willing to accept that change so I can then really move into the action of it. And then the other theory that I'll highlight today just a little bit on is Cotter's theory, like Leisa had said. It's a really commonly used one. I would say it's very, very well-rounded for parish life. It has a lot of the pretty structural steps that you can take. And one of my favorite parts of this theory, and probably the one that we've referenced already today, and Leisa and I, again, also love to talk to, is this idea of building a coalition for change. So you yourself don't need to be an expert in everything. In fact, maybe you're not the one who's going to know how to use all these change management theories, but I bet there's someone in business or someone with a background somewhere in your parish who might know something about this. And so maybe they really step up to the plate. Maybe you identify their gifts and you help build this coalition and lead it, not as the change management expert, but as someone who's passionate about the change. Leisa, I'll let you jump in because I know you love Cotter.
Well, I do love Cotter. And one of the reasons that I love Cotter is the whole idea of that coalition that not only is going to start looking at not only why does something need to change and what is that change all about, but also the implications for that change throughout the organization. And so to go back to that, that idea of the RCIA, as an RCIA coordinator, I was looking at, okay, so I have to have a team now that can do year round. I've got to have a process for bringing people in whenever they inquire. But I also had to work with our liturgical director to say, okay, we're going to start doing Sunday dismissals much more frequently than we have in the past. We're going to need to be able to have the rite of acceptance a couple of times a year at least, rather than just one time, and so on. And so that guiding coalition is the group that helps you to look at all of the implications within our parishes or our schools or whatever it might be. And then the coalition also begins to anticipate where are the likely places of opposition or challenge or whatever that might be, because that's part of change. That's part of the reason why people avoid change is that there are going to be people that are going to kind of fight this. Yeah. And so the coalition helps us not only to think through that, but to know that we're not alone, that this is not a one-person endeavor. And that makes a big difference.
Your coalition, because I also talked about, communication being this huge gap that can often cause change to fail. Your coalition is almost like your practice run of all communication. Yeah. You'll be able to fine tune and tweak and understand what resonated with them and what didn't, and what's going to be consistent, and how do you maybe adapt it, because not every person in your parish is going to hear what you intend them to hear in all the venues that we now have to provide this information. Is it an email? Is it a parish announcement? If you're virtual, what does that mean? So that coalition is going to be a toolkit in and of itself to making this change successful.
Yeah, I think that's great. A couple of questions that have started to come in related to this. So thinking about these theoretical models, and I find the theoretical models helpful just because it seems to help me organize the bite-sized pieces. Yeah. So thinking about unfreezing or preparation or however we want to talk about that first step. How do you prepare other people, or how do you develop sort of a consistent practice of preparation, so it's not necessarily episodic, like, well, it's been 6 years, so let's prepare ourselves for something different. How do you keep that, that consistent reality of preparation alive in a community or an organization?
I think a lot of it is, part of it's a culture that you build and develop over time with your parish. Part of it is also just, again, this, I'm going to keep going back to communication. It's so important and such a critical tool for change, in that, you may let them know a change is coming, or you may let them know, hey, here's a new problem that's arisen, and we're assembling a group of people who are going to work on this, and we'll be taking you along in this journey. You may also let them be the ones who bring to you the changes that are needed, right? So as a parish, we often use these surveys and these different tools to understand what they need and how we need to evolve. And then sometimes we do something with them, and then sometimes they kind of go by the wayside. So how do you really pull out those true nuggets and use them to drive this change, and then bring those people in to that circle to continue to, like, if they see change in action and they see change reinforced as a positive experience, it's easier to continually be in that prepare phase.
Yeah.
I was very blessed as a parish leader that when I was first brought on as a staff member, I found that our parish already had a pastoral council commission system. There were 7 essentially guiding coalitions, each one focused in a specific area of parish life. And the charge for those commissions was to look at the current practice and then to begin to look at what needs to happen now. And I actually had 2 different commissions that I worked with, a faith formation one and one for stewardship. And we met monthly. And we set up our meetings so that we were constantly asking ourselves, where are we? Where are we hoping to go? We're never going to get there. We are never going to be finished with this. But what are some of the immediate next steps that we can take? Some of those were tiny little adjustments, and some of them were pretty incredible. But because we had those groups, then in a moment like this, if I were a parish leader right now, I'd be going to my worship commission and saying, okay, let's get on Zoom and let's talk about what was the first month like and what do we need to be doing. And I saw the question from Tish, and Tish, you and I are in a very similar situation. Our governor's getting ready to talk tonight, and we're a little bit concerned that we might be heading out of public liturgy. And yeah, how do you make those turn on a dime? Well, if you already have a group of people that are working with this, then they're the ones that are going to help us to shift. If you don't, maybe now's the time that you start building that. And again, just to your point a few minutes ago, I think sometimes we forget that we already have people that we're connected to at a parish level, at a diocesan level, that are working with these kinds of things in their workplace, and so we don't have to do this on our own. We can learn from them and draw on their experience and their expertise as we navigate what are really choppy waters right now.
Yeah, the example that you gave, Leisa, seems to underscore both having the existing structures for communication, but also having the pre-existing condition in your community of conversation, of the fact that you have the example that you gave, whether for my community or organization, or whether it works to have standing committees or not, but there seems to be a pervasive culture of dialogue, so that when something comes up we need to talk about, not only have we been talking about issues and so we're equipped, but also we know how to talk to one another.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be, to your point, Jess, this requires communication, and we're not great at communication on a parish level by and large. That not only means we don't have the ability to communicate. When we did our Homecoming Sunday series a few months ago, and we had a friend of mine on, John Rogers, talking about stewardship and giving, and how can you do annual giving even in the midst of a pandemic. He gave this statistic that the majority of parishes in the United States have an email list for less than 30% of their members. So not only do we not have the structures to communicate with people, but that means we also just don't know how to talk to people. How many times have we been in let's have a town hall meeting for our parish, and it just has devolved into one of those town hall meeting scenes from Parks and Rec or something, right? It's so painful. So we don't have those muscles built, and I think that's a problem too. Another question here: How do you know when change is needed? How do you know when change is happening? How do you know we're in this, if we have this unfreeze, change, refreeze, how do we know when we need to get from refreeze to unfreeze again? What are the indicators or the signs?
Yeah, so I think Bex re-highlighted what Leisa had just said about, let me find it here. Our chat is just so busy, I love it. Where are we going, and what are our next steps, first steps or next steps? And so when you've put a change path in place, one of the many steps is trying to figure out, what does success look like? If this went really well, what would that look like for us? What are the ways in which we'll know this went well? And it might be parish feedback, or there might be a specific metric that you're looking for. Like maybe there are metrics within your parish that are going to say like, oh, our financial giving is going to go up by X%. And that means we did whatever project we wanted to really well, and it's considered successful. So part of the change theory is that you keep going back to those success measures. And when you see them start to disintegrate, that's a good gut check for you to say, ooh, something's off. Either what we did is no longer relevant, or it maybe still is, but we just need to tweak or make sure that it's top of mind for everyone and that they're still living out this change.
And I think sometimes we know change is necessary. We need to talk with others to identify what are the specific changes, and it's usually multiple changes within a larger change initiative. And then who's going to do what, and we start to build the plan around it. I saw someone say, you know, what did Lisa's parish look like before? I can tell stories that it takes too long. Let's just say it wasn't good. But the interesting thing was it didn't change overnight. There were incremental changes that happened really over the course of 3 to 5 years. But looking back, that 3 years felt like it flew because there were these constant little adjustments. And in fact, the running joke for 3 years among the worship commission members was, oh gosh, what's going to happen on the first Sunday of Advent? Because all of the, you know, kind of liturgical adjustments that were being made happened on the first Sunday of Advent. But after 3 years of first Sundays of Advent, we kind of were in a different sort of pattern. But we were, and Jess and I have talked about this a lot, so much of this comes down to intentionality and the willingness to say, we're not just going to stay with where we've always been. And that is like the bane of pastoral ministers' existence, was we've always done it this way. And so we have to make up our minds that among our guiding coalition, whoever that is, whatever their role is, that they're going to be really intentional about leading and managing this change.
You know, it made me think, Leisa, that often, so one of the very common problems that we know that people discuss in the parish ministry world is like, the youth aren't coming along on this journey with us, or like we lose them, right? Like they come and then they go, they disaffiliate. And part of that is our own organization's like practices of, are we just here and surviving? Or are we evolving? Are we keeping up with the times? Are we engaging people where they're at today? Not where we're at, but where they are at. And that's how we really thrive, which I know is another element of Cotter's theory that you particularly like to reference.
Well, and a couple of things there. I'll mention this in a minute, but come back to, you know, one of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about our guiding coalition is, do we have young people involved? Do we have people involved that maybe disagree with us, or that don't see things in as rosy a light as we might? Because we need to have those voices helping to cast the future with us. And I cannot tell you how many times I've talked with parish leaders and they've said, you know, that we do all these things for young people and they never come. And when I say, but have you talked with them? There's this, no, haven't done that, you know, and so, you know, that needs to be part of our planning from the outset. Jess, you mentioned the Cotter surviving and thriving. I think this is something really basic that we could be thinking about right now. You know, a lot of ours in our parishes right now are about survival. You know, it's maybe we have public liturgy, maybe we don't, maybe we didn't, now we do, but maybe we're not going to again. You know, we don't have parish meetings. You know, we might have the ability to have 15 if we can all spread out, but we certainly aren't going to be able to have our big parish socials and all of that kind of thing. And so right now, a lot of what we're thinking about is simple survival. You know, how are we going to manage to you know, to keep the fundraising or the financial stewardship in place in such a way that, you know, we're not falling apart financially in the midst of this, which is a huge consideration for parish leaders right now. But at the same time, if we can begin to say, but in the future, we have the hope of thriving discipleship within our parish community, and we're going to begin to actively work toward that now, even knowing that it's probably not going to look like what it might have in the past, that if we can hold that in healthy tension, that we actually have the ability to lead for change in a very challenging time.
Yeah. And I think that's helpful to frame it that way. And I wonder if I mean this leads to a whole bunch of other if thens and situations and things like that. I would imagine one of the questions, comments that's often brought up then, given everything you just mentioned, is forming these coalitions sounds wonderful, but it's a coalition of the willing, right? What about the unwilling? And namely, especially if we're navigating a change process or trying to put some of these things in place, what do I do in particular if my pastor or other key players in sort of ministerial leadership in particular in my parish just aren't quite on board yet? So could you say something about the, especially under Cotter's model, the coalition expectation? What do you do if it's not you can't assemble the coalition of all of the key players or all of the key partners that you hope to?
I think you can think about it in two ways. You have stakeholders and you've got your coalition. Your stakeholders are people who are integral to make sure that the change is going to happen, but they may not be like your active group who are working on and creating and driving forward the change. And so you're in the best parishes, your priest is part of your coalition and wants to be there and everything is great. It's not always a time commitment they can make. And sometimes they're just not the type of leader who want to be involved in that part of the process, or they could be against the change that you're proposing. So you're going to think through, okay, who are my stakeholders? Do I need all of my stakeholders to be part of the coalition or not? Or can I tease them out? And then your coalition is really going to think through, how then am I going to get the buy-in of the pastor? Like, what's most important to him? And how are we going to then make sure that when we're sharing and when we're communicating our strategies to him, or the way in which we want to change or why we want to change, that we're really tailoring it to him as an individual and what we need from him to make this successful. I think the individual component of change management can be exhausting. It really can. But again, that's why we have a coalition, so that it's not just you. But like reaching out, especially in parish life, to people individually to say, hey, I see these talents or these gifts in you. Will you come along on this journey with me? Or saying, hey, I know that this change might make you uncomfortable. And so I'm reaching out to you personally because I want to just provide some additional context and have a dialogue with you about it, so that we can figure out how together we move forward. Again, those small nuances and details are going to make or break whether it's successful.
Justice, as you were talking, I was thinking about another example from my own life in the parish. We made some major adjustments in our confirmation preparation process at one point, and confirmation preparation became a process of participation in a small faith community for the final year of preparation. It was parent-led. In small groups, and we actually did single gender groups, so boys groups, girls groups, just because of the awkward age that our young people who were preparing for confirmation were taking part in. And now this was a major change initiative. We had to work with the parents of students in our parish school. We had to work with parents of the students in our religious education program, and all of the circles of parish life. But I remember at one point, after we had made the announcement that this was what was going to be happening, and again, communication, this is where we're heading next year. And so we've got a year to get ready for this. And I was initially stunned at how little negative feedback we were getting. And finally, one of the parents said, well, Lisa, we know that you're only asking our children to do things that you want everyone to do. Everyone's supposed to be growing as a disciple. Everyone is supposed to be, involved in some kind of faith formation. And so you're not asking us to bring our kids for something that you really don't want all of us to do. But had we not done all of the things just that you've been talking about, of laying that foundation and tilling the soil and and communicating in all sorts of ways, and then building that coalition that had fingers in all of those different circles of parish life, it could have been much more difficult than it actually ended up being. It turned out to be something that our parents were talking with people in other parishes about, and they started calling and saying, okay, tell us how you're doing this, because it seems to be something that we really need to be thinking about.
And Leisa, to do that, to do the process you described in the midst of a pandemic, to decide to move from just surviving back to like, okay, how are we going to put ourselves on a path to thrive is going to be hard. Like I'm on Zoom probably more than I watch TV, probably more than I even get outside nowadays. Like I feel like I live at my computer having these types of conversations, but that's the investment that I'm willing to make to keep moving things forward in all of my organizations that I'm a part of. So again, it's not always easy work, and maybe I need to do more to figure out how I can socially distance coffee and do other things just to get out of this Zoom world. But that's the investment that you have to figure out, like, are you willing to commit to and make now to know that then you have this already built up for if and when those big changes come.
Well, and I do think that on the kind of flip side of what you just said is because so much of our life really is on hold, maybe this is the time where we have an opportunity to have some of the deeper conversations about the role of the parish. And my title at the Archdiocese is about pastoral vitality. And we use that word very intentionally, that this is about, you know, when you go to the doctor and you learn your vital signs, it's a sign of how alive are you. And I think that's a really good question for us to be asking in our parishes right now. How alive are we? And how alive do we want to be able to be for the future? And maybe this is the time where we start to ask some of those really crucial questions.
I like that one of the there's so many things that the two of you have outlined about approaches to change management and the ways that we think about this on an individual and community level that I feel, you know, under being equipped, I feel equipped with a better sense of the model and a vocabulary that's really helpful. So I'm very appreciative of that. I wonder what, thinking about coalition building, right? In some ways, I think the first steps and first trials at coalition building can sometimes be very practical. I know I'm going to ask people who are going to say yes, or I know I'm going to ask people who say yes to everything or who are already doing everything, right? And it sounds to me in what you're saying that our coalition building needs to be more aspirational, you know, almost sort of not, I don't mean to say this in a way that's not helpful, but almost sort of like a focus group for my community, not just the people who show up already for things, but I need to get to the members of my community who maybe aren't showing up or aren't as visible. I need to be inclusive. Do you, whether I'm talking about this on a personal level, if I'm a parish leader, if we're talking about this as a community level, do you have any do's or don'ts for coalition building that's effective and that really helps provide a coalition for actual change?
You want to start there, Leisa?
You know, I was going to say two things. One, I do think we want some people that we know have a good sense of what already is and what perhaps needs to be. I think we also have to include a few people that either we don't know well, or that we might think could be the leaders of the opposition if given the opportunity, with the caveat that if they become toxic, if they can't come around to recognizing their role and the possibilities within our structure of Catholic pastoral life and our theology and all that we are and all that we are called to be, then there has to be an opportunity to, you know, disinvite. And that's really hard. So part of what I find parish leaders by and large really struggle with is identifying the expectations from the outset and then calling people to those expectations on an ongoing basis. And I think especially when we're building our coalition, that has to be part of the process.
Leisa, the expectations that you bring up are a really great point, because I think as a leader, if you're going to go out and ask your community members to come and join you in this, you need to think through what is the time commitment that you're asking of them and what are the expectations that you're hoping, in addition to then that personalized aspect or element of why you personally are asking this particular person, especially if it's someone you don't know well or someone who you think is going to be the opposition. Like, come to them and say, hey, Leisa, I'd love for you to be a part of this. I know you and I haven't worked together a lot in the past, but I heard your interests lie here. and we need someone like you to help influence the parish. The worst you can do is you ask and they say no.
Right.
And if it's a person who you're really passionate about engaging differently in your parish life, you may have to ask them 2 or 3 times for 2 or 3 different types of things before they finally feel called and ready to step up into that type of leadership role. Like maybe it's someone who doesn't want to be a leader, or someone who is so busy with work that they don't feel like they can commit. So again, helping them understand, how much time are you asking for? What are those expectations? What are you hoping to achieve, and why them?
Right.
Yeah.
And to loop back, way back to the beginning of our conversation, you know, that idea that, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. It was there, and then I lost it. But that, just something that you said early on about, I see this in you, and therefore, you know, if we have the awareness of self that we started with, and we have the awareness of the people that we are already familiar with that we're inviting, then to be able to say to someone, this is what I see in you, and this is what I know we need. Here's what we're going to be about. So they have a real clear sense of what their role would be. And then we work through that together. And then especially the first year, every 3 months or so, we have a process where we kind of rediscern, or we make sure that we're all still, you know, in a good place with this. And everybody needs that out. You know, that person that's never been involved before, they need that out as much as we do.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful suggestion, that in the structure for conversations, in the timeline throughout a year of how a group functions, if this is a standing committee or some sort of, you know, group, that you build in the outs. Because how many times in our structures, especially within the church, but other organizations, is this you're elected to a 3-year term, and you can do 3 3-year terms in a row, but we'll also bend the rules. And it's one of those things where you're going to get renewed unless you say no. Well, now I'm stuck for 9 years, and that might not be helpful whatsoever for anybody, let alone me. You know, so I think that building that out is really helpful, or building the opt back ins. I think that's really great. I know. Unfortunately, we're out of time already, but I just want to take, for those of you listening, we just want to take a couple of more minutes to do a couple of things. One, I do want to get to a point where we can talk about resources, suggestions for resources and organizations. And again, if we don't get to them in conversation, we'll put them in the comments when we rebroadcast this, and also in the follow-up email. But before we get there, I realize, you know, just like I don't want to be, you know, cheesy here, but I mean, just like the whole, you know, let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me. I understand the, you know, let there be change and let it begin with me, and that I have to be open to, again, that prepare, equip, support, the unfreeze, change, refreeze, the coalition. I have to think about that for myself. Do you have any suggestions as I look at a constant cultivation of preparation for myself? How do I keep myself always prepared, so that then I can hopefully help others, or have the expectation of others being prepared? How do I keep myself prepared for change? What can I do? What can I look for? What can I think about?
Personally, for me, my journey has been around, my undergrad was at St. Kate's, and one of the things we talk about there quite frequently is lifelong learning. And this concept of lifelong learning is also just part of who I am, because my dad is an educator and many of my aunts and uncles are educators. So when I think of my own and my own self, and how I prepare myself for change, and how I continue, like if I get out of that funk of change and I'm realizing change is really hard for me right now, what do I need to do to reset? And for me, it goes back to educating myself. I go and find a new TED Talk. I go and find a new article. I reach out to a Leisa Anslinger or a Matt Reichert to say, okay, I'm stuck on this. What resources do you have? Who do you know? Like, I need to figure out where to go next. So I seek out learning opportunities to help propel myself. I know it's not everyone's preferred method. Maybe you'd rather have a conversation. Maybe you know, but for me personally, it's all about learning. I just have to grab onto that next idea to kind of propel myself forward.
And I know some people here have met my friend Stephanie Moore. Stephanie talks about having a personal board of directors. that are kind of your go-to, and especially if you're looking at some kind of massive change yourself, to have those go-to people that you can email or call or text and say, hey, can we just talk for a few minutes? This is what I'm up against, or this is what I'm thinking about. And I, that I'm one of those just too. I'm constantly learning, but I don't always know what to do with all of that stuff that I'm learning. And so that's when I reach out to somebody and say, just help me sift through this. And sometimes it's just a matter of 15 minutes on a Zoom call, and I'm ready to go again.
I'm going to put in a shameless plug there, Matt. One Call is hosting in that idea of like learning something and then needing to process it out loud. One Call is hosting a series of roundtable events, is what we're calling them. I think they start next week and go through the end of August. So far, there's just 3, but it's an opportunity to take content like today's, for example, watch it, process it yourself, and then come together with a group of people who are like-minded in that we're all based in this faith community, and really process and talk it out and understand and challenge each other and just have a really great dialogue about it. So if anyone is interested in that type of a learning model, change management isn't one of the topics currently selected, but there are a lot of other great topics, both from this series and others, that we'll be exploring. So highly recommend you check it out. It's on our webpage, onecallinstitute.org.
Yes, I'm all for that shameless plug. So good for you. I mean, I think, for someone like me, and then we're going to get to resources, and I promise we'll wrap up in just a couple of minutes. So thanks everyone for sticking with us. I think, as someone like my background in changing in terms of like social theory and social psychology and psychological development, like I get that, your example, Leisa, of a personal board of directors, or Stephanie's example of a personal board of directors, is fascinating to me, because just like, I am going to eat food every day. I have to be intentional about eating good food, right? But it's a given I'm going to be eating, or I need to consume something. The same thing happens for personal board of directors. Like you will have a personal board of directors. If you think about that, it's the intentionality is, do you cultivate that board of directors or not? Like, so if we all sat down and we thought, you walk into an organization and the board of directors, their pictures are all in the lobby. If I was going to put in the lobby of my house, my entryway, the people who serve as my board of directors, the people I consult most often, the people I listen to, the people whose opinions or input I take, whether I should or not, is that a board of directors I've cultivated, right? Is that a board of directors I would want? And then if not, how do I get it so that is so? I mean, we're going to have that. I think that's a really helpful suggestion.
And am I also willing to listen when they tell me something that I don't really want to hear? Because again, if we're being called to change, we're not always comfortable with that. We a lot of times want to say, I'm just wanting to put on my slippers and sit on the sofa and read, and so, to have that willingness to hear sometimes the hard things is part of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. So let's get to the and again, knowing we'll extend this, I know we wanted to talk about resources, organizations. Jess, you already mentioned the work of One Call in general, but also some of the upcoming things that are happening. Any other resources or organizations we want to make sure we mention before we sign off?
One little fun one is a long time coming, but it will be coming. Leisa and I are working with 23rd Publications, and we are actually, because we understand change management principles and theories are hard and that they don't always perfectly apply from the business world to the parish life, we're working on a change management book specifically about change management in the parish life. So my first writing venture and our first writing venture together. So that will be coming right now at the latest fall 2022, but more to come. You'll hear from us about it, but know that that's on its way.
Yeah. Matt, I think I sent you the link to the Cotter article about surviving and thriving, and that's actually really recent, but I do think that it's short, but there's a lot there to think about, and especially as we're navigating these choppy waters right now, I think it can be thought-provoking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one final thing that I've been thinking a lot about too, just putting these things together. By the way, if you could make sure in your book to have a chapter about how to disinvite somebody who's become toxic, that'd be great, because there's lots of questions. So that must be a common facet to those of us working.
You can reach out to Leisa or I personally on social media, and we'll help talk you through that.
Perhaps 2 chapters. But I think about this sense of agency, and I think one resource that of course we have are ourselves and our own particular strengths and gifts and the connections that we have. And one resource we have is the agency to make and manage change within the spheres that we occupy. So yes, I'm assuming that many of you who are listening and joined us today, or many of you who are listening to the rebroadcast, are in positions of actual leadership within a parish or organization, and that's wonderful. But for those who aren't, and even if we run into a situation where we have, the number of times we say, wouldn't it be great if the bishops had? Wouldn't it be great if the diocese had? Wouldn't it be great if our parish had? Wouldn't it be great if our company had? And yes, it would be great. And we hope that those things happen, and we keep calling for those things to happen. But until that happens, we still have our own sphere where we can try to manage and navigate change, put together coalitions, assemble our board of directors where we can. And I mean, if all of us, let's talk about masks, right? If all of us individually wore masks, look at what we can do, right? Wouldn't it be great if everyone wore masks? Sure. But if all of us who are saying that wore one, we take a chunk out of the equation, right? If all of us look at the extent to which we can make change, that agency with which we're equipped, that's a resource too. So I think to put in a plug to say, while we wait for national organizations for national things, we can make localized change. And that principle of subsidiarity, I think that's so close to the heart of the church, I think is important in a situation like this. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Leisa, not only for your time here, but I know for the time that you devote and you spend in your home communities with One Call, with your archdiocese, with the other communities that you work with, for this book that's coming. Thanks to 23rd for publishing it and knowing that this is such an important resource for all of us. We'll keep our eyes out for it. Thanks to all of you who have joined us today for taking a time in the midst of sometimes change that feels crushing, to ask these questions, to want to know how to be a part of it. That's a wonderful resource too. So thank you for your example. Please let others know about this conversation. Please look for the archived recording and share it with others. If you have other questions or conversations you'd love to see us host, please let us know. Look for other summer series conversations that are coming up. And in the meantime, again, just thank you for your ministry and your witness and everything you're doing for your communities and our church, especially in these difficult times. So thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon and God bless. We'll see you soon.